Hello and welcome to Elden Kings and Elden Ring Discussion. I am your host, Gideon the Half-Knowing, and tonight's topic is Miquella the Unalloyed or Miquella the Kindly, and more specifically, their power over enchantment and charm. Joining me tonight is another content creator known as AHumanJusticar, who will take a deep dive into the subject with me. How are you doing tonight, Justicar?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on. I know that you've been, very deep into the lore about Miquella and his charm effects for a little bit. Maybe you were a bit right in your earlier days before the DLC.
It's been a while. It's been over 2 years now, I think. At this point, I've been touting about his blood magic, and so I'm excited to see some of that come into fruition for sure.
Yeah, I imagine it's a little bit satisfying.
A little bit, just a little.
Yeah, so let's get right into it. I think like one of the biggest things to explore is the nature of enchantment and the nature of what it means to be charmed by Miquella. So like what are the nature and structure and limitations of his power, and where does his enchanting ability come from? Do you have any ideas to kick us off with?
Well, I do love the way that you brought up just how the enchantment works. In our minds, we all have different ways of interpreting what enchantment or bewitchment or hexing looks like. And the words kind of invoke different meanings to all of us. But I think in the DLC especially, we see that it is one specific kind of way that Miquella is able to enchant people, and it's through love. It's through their hearts. It's something we discover pretty early on in the DLC that somehow, some way, he has this effect to steal people's hearts or to steal their love from them, instead of this, puppet controlling or mind controlling. I mean, it does have mind effects, but it definitely comes from a place of hearts. We get a lot of mentionings of love, stealing of hearts, stolen hearts throughout the entire DLC from like the beginning to the end. So, yeah, I think that's really cool. But which is not something that I think I guessed at all in the beginning. Did you?
The idea that Miquella would use people's hearts as an avenue into into gaining loyalty from them, is that what you mean?
Kind of more so like, yeah, because I know that from the DLC trailer, we saw Shrive clean the hearts of men, and that kind of gave us an idea, but I wasn't sure about what that exactly meant, and I wasn't sure that that was 100% the way he was going to be going about it before the DLC trailer dropped. Because like you said, we've been talking about this blood magic, hexing, bewitchment for a really long time now, way before the DLC announcement dropped. And I wasn't on the path. It wasn't on my bingo card that was going to be heart stolen. That wasn't my bingo card.
It is a wonderful special death animation, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
But yeah, I completely agree. I can see how when you look at the base game, a lot of the bewitching powers you see are like more simplistic. Like you hit someone with a special bewitching branch needle and they instantly turn to your side. It's more mechanical looking. It doesn't involve so much of like the personality of like whispering in your ear and promising an age of compassion to convince you, like get into your heart and sway you to his side.
Right, right.
In a previous episode, I talked a little bit about like it with a person named Quirkus who talked about George Martin's influence on it and how in A Song of Ice and Fire and other books that he's written, like even Fever Dream, which is a book about like vampires in the Mississippi, it's fun. But like there's this idea of charm as like as an inherent human ability of mesmer. In Fever Dream, it uses the word mesmer, and I think Fever Dream could be taken to be an influence on Bloodborne in ways. It's very vampire heavy. I feel like George Martin was hired because they respected his work, but
Mm-hmm.
I feel like in all of those senses, there's this idea of enchantment or bewitchment as sort of the historical view on words as being magic, as having like an innate power. Like when you look at like the historical 14th century witch who's burned for like convincing people to do evil and like bewitching people, like she's not she's not someone who's actually like has magic. She's just someone who's like convincing people. Like maybe she's been slandered for
Right.
sleeping with people. Maybe she's just want people. She's got like land and people want to steal it from her. Like it's. So I feel like under that angle, you can sort of look to Griffith. I know people were really angry about the Miquella to Griffith thing. I don't know how you felt about it, but I feel like it was sort of an extension of rejecting his charm and bewitching attitudes. And I don't think it's a one-to-one comparison, but if in Berserk there's this affinity to Griffith's character where people want to follow him because they believe in him, because he has like an innate
Mm-hmm.
charm and attraction to him in like how he presents his ideals, how he's noble, how he's sort of like ethereal, his like ethereal beauty, I guess.
And like a part of his innocence too, right? He's so pure looking, even just his character design on the page. You see in Berserk, there's so much dirt and blood and disgustingness, and he's so bright and clean and this shining beacon. And I feel like Miquella, in a lot of ways, was presented like that to us in Elden Ring. He is this shining beacon. He is this purity. He uses unalloyed gold, which is pure gold. There's a lot of talk around that. So I definitely see the parallels for sure.
Yeah. Even on his path to godhood, he sacrifices everything that makes himself human. He discards it in ascending to something that maybe
Mm-hmm.
he shouldn't be. But let's not get too distracted in Berserk
I
references.
know.
Um, Now, we've got the nature of the charm. We've discussed parts of it, but I, I'm sort of curious how you feel about like enchantment as blind loyalty. If you look at the bewitching branch description, it says that the Empyrean Miquella is loved by many people. Indeed, he has learned very well how to compel such affection. He realizes the power that he has in making people love him, and you see in St. Trina's arrow that it says the priests of St. Trina use these arrows to spread their teachings. The sweet oblivion of sleep can become quite the habit, so it's not just that the charm is something that gives people blind loyalty and peace. It's something that's almost addicting. Once you start to follow someone like this figure, it's hard to stop, I guess.
I could see that. And I also see the flip side as well for Miquella being almost addicted to charming or maybe unable to stop charming. Because he even charms people who are already, we think, are already loyal to him, right? The Needle Knights. Needle Knight Lita tells us, "Did you meet my compatriots? They all would have come to blows at first glance were it not for the charm kindly Miquella put upon us." So she even too is openly admitting that even though she would follow him and continues to follow him after the charm, and same with Redmane Freya and a few others, that they've all been charmed. They all have had this charm put upon them. Why does he do that? Why does he feel compelled to? Is it something that he can control? I think that's something I've discussed with a few people previously when we talk about whether or not Miquella is a good or evil character. I don't think many characters in Elden Ring can be considered purely good or purely evil. There's a lot of evilness that happens, but I don't think is one specific evil person in Elden Ring, and I don't think Miquella is evil either. So it kind of comes down to, is he able to control it? Is he unable to? Is it addicting? Do people want to be controlled by it? Kind of similarly to how with Renala and the Amber Egg, right? When they're rebirthed, they can't help but continue to rely on the system of rebirth. They want to do it over and over again until they eventually like lose themselves. So yeah, I do see this like a little bit of addiction side to both of those coins when it comes to Miquella and his charming abilities. When it comes to like specifically his allies, I think it kind of throws all of his allies into question, if I'm being completely honest. Just my opinion. Because it seems like there are traces of his charms almost in every single interaction we have with his allies. There can be arguments for every single one of them. So did Miquella actually have any true allies if he were unable to charm? I think is an interesting question to pose, because we're not really sure, right?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that's a really good angle of discussion on it too, because like you say, there's no one that should be depicted as pure evil or pure good. Like one of the points of Elden Ring is that there's a nuance to each person's viewpoint that's explored in their failing or success in that viewpoint.
Right.
And yeah, like under Miquella, you have this idea of like it's so easy for him to compel affection and loyalty. And if he wants to save people, then wouldn't he be willing to open his arms and embrace everyone and give them the full extent, of his love and compassion? And under that lens, like, it would be addicting. Like, if he wants to see himself as a savior figure, if he wants to try and help everyone, then it makes sense that he would just just use these powers of affection. Like, what if he didn't even see them as fully evil? What if he just, it might just be a natural extension of how he exists, and he might not even realize the full extent of his effect on people until he starts to wield it as a weapon. And at that point, he's already decided to use it in his own favor.
Right. And I think that comes down to one of the biggest questions that I was posing, which is where does Miquella's enchanting abilities actually come from? And we both kind of agreed that it had to have come from one of two places, his Great Rune or his Empyrean Blood, and kind of looking at both of those. Now, I wrote down kind of arguments for both because I can see an argument for either or. But I definitely land in one specific category. I'm interested into what you think, if you think it's either one of those.
I think I'm sort of torn. I think his Empyrean blood gives him, like, I don't know, that sort of demigod, you can do something special, sort of superhero, personal, unique ability. And I think that in that sense, his unique ability manifested in Saint Trina and sort of his just sort of natural messiah type splendor that people liked in him. And
Yeah.
I feel like when you look at Saint Trina with her focus on sleep and her priest's obsession with her, you see this
Mm-hmm.
sort of like young budding ability of enchantment, and I feel like that might have taken off into the full extent of its power once it met with the Great Rune. We've got this idea from the intro of the game that the demigods got inhuman strength from their great runes, but they were also tainted by it. Like,
Right.
Rykard's such an easy example because he probably was, he was greedy and ambitious, but he wasn't fully descended into madness and greed and like the
Right.
whole family thing. Yeah.
Wasn't insane and let a serpent eat everybody.
Yeah, literally.
Yeah, I agree. I think that makes the most sense that it comes from this original form. I mean, we read that both of him and Melania were afflicted since birth with rot and with this eternal youth. So we know that demigods are special, but we know that Empyreans are an even more special branch of the demigods. And the Empyrean blood of Miquella, I mean, we're literally finding it all over the place in the DLC. A, because he's, destroying his body, which makes sense. But B, because it also seems very tied into his powers, his strength. His strength comes from his Empyrean blood. And I think you kind of hit the nail on the head when you said that the Great Rune kind of only just exacerbated that. It made it more powerful. It made him more powerful. And kind of just I think what's interesting too is that and I wrote this down, Miquella's Great Rune, it only retains, after he's abandoned it, it only retains the ability to resist charms. However, the charm doesn't break until Miquella abandons it, which I find very interesting. So it doesn't say that it once held the ability to charm others. It just says it retains the ability to resist charms, and that in a sense the charm was broken after he abandoned it. So I'm curious to know what you think about that specifically.
I think I'm not sure entirely. I think the easiest reading of it is that, like, I think the exact reading, I wrote it down somewhere. A great rune relinquished by Miquella, broken and bereft of its bounty. It retains naught but the power to resist charms. And I think that in that second sentence where it says broken and bereft of its bounty, it retains not but the power. You could, the easiest reading is that it used to have power over charming, but after it broke, the only power over charm that it had still was the power to resist it. But I feel like there's other ways of looking at it too. I don't think that the
Hmm.
easiest reading is always the right one. So I guess that's my initial thoughts on it. Do you have any way to take that, or any like, flip or inverse that you think applies here?
Well, I just think his great rune is important to try to understand this, charming ability. Because again, like you said, we can interpret that once before it had this bountiful power to charm. And like we discussed before we hopped on here, I've had a lot of people in my comments eager to talk about Miquella for many years now. And so many of them have pointed out again and again that the only connection between Miquella and Charming is his blood, his bewitchment branch, and it seems to be not who he really is. That's what I heard a lot of opinions where that's not who he really is. That's not really his desires. But if his great rune retains some sort of connection to Charming, I think it really does show this connection to his desires, right? Because the great runes are each and all affected through the demigod that has them, the shard bearer, by what they're actually enduring at the moment. Radon's, it burns to resist the rot. Melania's is half rotted itself. All of these different aspects of the runes, they almost become warped and changed depending on what the demigod is enduring at the time. And so I think that it does go to speak to his intentions, and it does go to speak to his abilities being more innate within him than a result of this tainting of the great rune. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I was sort of I think it's really interesting because you can go a number of directions with that. And I definitely agree with the core of it too, because I think that to see Miquella as someone who was only affected by the rune and like wasn't didn't use enchantment beforehand, I think is like a misreading, because we can assume that Saint Trina existed before the Shattering War and that he was,
Exactly.
yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that, it really is just one of those things where I think one of the things with the Elden Ring is that it's sort of like, have you played Sekiro at all? Do you know about the Divine Dragon?
I have not.
Okay, in Sekiro, there's this idea that the divine dragon comes to Earth, and in doing that, it sort of blends the realm between the divine and the earthly. And in doing that, like, the divine dragon begins to rot, but also the people of Earth, like, some of them are granted immortality, but the immortality warps reality to the point where dragon rot becomes a thing. And I think it's sort of the same thing with the Elden Ring. Like, the Elden Ring was never meant to exist on Earth. Like, that's why Ranni's ending is presented as, the good ending. And
Mm-hmm.
in that way, the Great Runes are something that, when taken up by the demigods, who are earthly beings, they are warped by the demigods, and the demigods warp them back. So it's like you say, like, Miquella probably was taken to an even greater height with the charming by having the rune, but then he changed the nature of the rune back just by possessing it. Like,
Right.
Rykard's rune
Mm-hmm.
was eaten by a serpent, even if it probably made him ambitious enough to let himself be eaten by a serpent. It's like a
Right. It's a bit of a double-edged sword, but yeah, that's really interesting. I didn't know that about Sekiro.
yeah. One thing I think is interesting while we're on the topic of discarding the Great Rune is the parallels between Miquella and Ranni. I talked about this with, like, I've got my, like, friend group that I talk of Elden Ring with, and we've talked about it a lot, and I think one of the things that came up was this idea that Miquella, who was born with these innate powers of charm and these sort of innate inclinations towards godhood and rulership, is sort of a direct contrast to Ranni, who was born as someone who is sort of othered as a witch and who chose the dark side of the moon, which is very much like, it's like the loner path, the dark path of the Empyrean. But along both of their paths, they both discard their great runes to try to attain something beyond the scope of the Elden Ring and the Golden Order. And in discarding those, they both go after godhood. They both try to make an age that will last 1,000 years, but they have such different views on it that feels almost informed by how they feel about how affection should be given and reciprocated, which I feel like is embodied in some of Miquella's charm. I'm not sure how much of that resonates with you.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. I made a video called, I think it's just The Great Rune of the Unborn, where basically I was going through theorizing where the Amber Egg came from and then where the Great Rune came from and whose Great Rune was it. And there was really only three candidates, and Ranni and Miquella were the two main contenders for that. And now we know more than yes or no, it's definitely Ronnie's. So that makes sense to me. And Miquella had this kind of obsession with the Carians, but what I find interesting about what you said is that even though Ranni was a Carian princess, even though her mother was the queen, even though she had all of this kind of handed down to her, she very much rejected it and didn't want to be very much a part of it. She wanted more of the humble beginnings of what her mother had, you know, taking her by the hand and showing her the dark moon and really being in root with the celestial body and the witchery and the cold iciness of the mountaintops, which we don't see in Liurnia. But that harkens back to the old astrologers, you know, the predecessors of the sorcerers. So we see this like personality difference between the two of them, where Miquella wants very much to have a path in the Golden Order, but eventually rejects it because it can't do anything for his and his sister's curse. Whereas Ranni, she harkens back for the old days. She doesn't want to be a part of this monarchy, she does want godhood, I think, but not in the way that Miquella is pursuing it. Miquella is doing just about everything he can to figure out how it was done and how he can do it in a different way. Whereas Ranni, it almost seems to just like fall into place for her. She's just been waiting so long for something to happen, waiting so long to slay her own fingers. She even still tries to reject you when you want to be her consort. You know, the description of her ring saying, "Don't take this," essentially. "Don't come with me on my cold path." But in the end, still finding a way to do it and taking the Elden Ring and the Golden Order, essentially, but her order, what she would turn it into, away from Earth, away from the lands between, away from humanity, whatever you want to call it, and returning to the stars, returning to the sky. I think that's kind of really interesting in the difference between her and Miquella, because they want a similar outcome, but they go about it in such different ways. Because Miquella seems to be charming up an army, and he uses his siblings as like a catalyst for himself. And he, well, when I say siblings, I'm talking about Mogh specifically, obviously, to find a way into the land of shadows. There's so much more mystery, and there's so much more, I don't want to say selfishness, but a little bit, yeah, of selfishness for Miquella versus Ranni, who very much loves her people and doesn't want them to be hurt by her actions, but she knows that by them choosing to stay with her, they will be. And I think she accepts it. Whereas Miquella kind of, I don't know, I don't want to say tosses everyone to the side, but it kind of seems like at a certain point, when you abandon everything, including your love, that does mean you abandoned your love for your people. So I think he loses that aspect of himself. And Ranni seems to be the more compassionate one or sympathetic. I don't know how you would phrase that if you wanted to.
Yeah, absolutely. I really like the way that you touch upon how Miquella was a Golden Order fundamentalist until he realized it wouldn't help him. Yeah, like, he
Right.
believed until he realized that the belief was flawed, and then rather than rejecting it sort of like Ranni does, where she decides that, oh, if this belief doesn't work, then I'm going to get rid of it. I'm going to ascend beyond it. Like, Miquella has this idea of, I'll just make a new belief.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, like, that's part of where the failing goes. I think that it might all, I don't know how much I feel about this, but it might even be sort of a misnomer to call Ranni a god in her ending. I know that she follows the typical path and companionship of, like, a lord and their god, But she doesn't pass through the divine gate, and she doesn't take the Elden Ring for herself. She sort of just lets it fade. So there's no like ascendancy of being, like how Miquella goes through the divine gate after abandoning his flesh and he's reborn. There's just sort of, I don't know how much of that you
Just
agree
kind of
with.
is. No, yeah, I
Yeah.
agree. I do. Because I feel like we've seen that a lot in conversations across YouTube or Reddit or wherever where people are discussing whether or not Ronnie's ending is the quote unquote good ending and if whether or not Miquella's Age of Compassion would be the bad ending. And I mean, obviously, it's hard to put things, like I said earlier, no good or bad. But Ranni doesn't go through all this trouble to ascend. In fact, I made an Empyreans video not too long ago where I talked about Empyreans specifically being this vessel for godhood. But it takes away so much of themselves. You know, a vessel rather than a vassal. A vessel holds something inside of it. It's like a container. And when you say Marika is the vessel for the Elden Ring, well, where did her soul go? Where did she go if she's holding the Elden Ring inside of her? Does that mean Empyreans must lose a part of their souls? There's a whole section where I talked about Melania potentially losing a part of her soul when she Scarlet Blooms the third time, that sort of a thing. And I think that a part of it is semi-confirmed when we look at Miquella's road in the DLC. He loses so much of himself, has to give up so much of himself. And St. Trina says, almost word for word, what I said in that video, which was, it's a prison. Godhood is not a good thing. This is a prison for 1,000 years. It's not something that's going to bring anybody anything. When I say anybody, I mean the Empyreans, any happiness. It basically seems to tear them apart and it destroys who they once were. And with Ranni, we don't see that. I mean, we do because she kills herself. But she's desperately trying to throw away her Empyrean flesh because I think she knows and doesn't want to lose herself. She's willing to get rid of the strength and the power kind of similarly to Miquella, but so that she can be free of it, not in the same way that Miquella wants to become a god and a different kind of god. I don't know the details. This is something I'll have to do a lot more research on. But I do think it's interesting to see the difference between the two because they both do get rid of their bodies. But I think the question kind of becomes, where did Miquella's soul go? What happened to it? Versus Ranni, we know that's her spirit. We know that she's embodied in this doll. And we know she still retains herself. So I don't know. That's kind of a question I've tossed back and forth. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm also torn on it because it gets so deep into like some of the nuances of just speculation rather than fully explicit text. Because like
Exactly.
even with Ranni, who we know to retain a lot of herself, she's described as occasionally having, two egos. Or, like, she literally has two faces, which is, you could see it as her soul not being properly seated in the body or some sort of, like, after effects. But, like, Celavis mentions that she might be nice to the Tarnished, but she can act like an ice queen. Her doll is modeled after the snowy crone. Like, there is an idea of her. I don't even know what the idea is fully, to be perfectly honest. And I don't know if I want to call it multiple personalities either. But I do. I feel like like that's the only thing that I would bring up like out of favor with the idea of her retaining herself. But like, I really do agree because I feel like Miquella, in ascending to whatever he becomes after the Divine Gate, ascending to godhood, he leaves half of himself behind in Saint Trina, and what of the part that ascends is still him after he transforms. Like you say, it's. I really love the phrase "captive divinity."
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to go too far away from it. But I feel like it has like Dune influence in a way. But I let's stay on topic for now with just the idea of Ranni and Miquella and like their own sort of agency and what they become. Because I'm curious what you think of the Snowy Crone and Ranni in the context of your own theory regarding her and Miquella.
Yeah, I mean, Celiavis isn't really a good
He's not very trustworthy as a source of
Right.
information.
Yeah, I was going to say. So there are people in the game who I consider, we can't always take every bit of information at face value. And some of the characters are trusted sources of information and some are not. And a lot of my theories, this is going to sound weird, but a lot of my theories are based around Pastor Muriel says, because Pastor Muriel is a very, very good source of information and he's very trusted. He's one of the few who is completely right about things. He nails it on the head about the stone statue being Radagon's secret. So if he's right about something as secretive as that, he's probably right about everything else he says, in my opinion. Whereas there are some other people whose information I kind of take with a grain of salt. A lot of what Gideon Ofnir says, I do like kind of turning on its head sometimes, because again, he's just another tarnished who's searching for the information versus some of the other sources in the game. So I don't know about Cybus. He seems a little slimy. I don't really trust his source, but it's possible that the coldness is something that is bad. It shows a duality between her, this two sides of the same kind of coin. And the same can be said about Miquella. He loves people. He wants to heal his sister's scarlet rot. He healed Redmane Freya's. He made the unalloyed gold needles. Obviously, there is goodness in what he does. But we see the other side of that coin. So it's definitely possible for Ranni as well.
Yeah. Like, even in the context of what Cybus says, like, I can understand why Ranni would be cold to Cybus, who is a sexual predator by lore.
And actively trying to make her into a puppet? Is that what he's trying to do?
Yeah. So, like, even within the context,
I would be cold. Yeah. I'd give him the cold shoulder, too, because he's kind of a creep, so
I think
I don't
only
blame her.
giving him the cold shoulder is very merciful of her.
Right.
But yeah, really, I agree, though. I think that the idea of Miquella losing something and becoming a god is very there. I've always been, jokingly, I call it being America apologist, but, like, I just think that, like, some people like to flatten out Queen America into, like, just a villain, not anyone who might have wanted to do good at once, despite her making a giant tree that healed everyone nearby.
Right.
Like, yeah, she conquered the world, but she also did it because she wanted to give people a safe haven and create this bountiful religion that can bring peace to the land, And I think that part of Miquella's, I guess, character might have been sacrificed on the pyre of making the core idea and thematic idea of Elden Ring resonate more by being like, gods are bad, guys, come on, get it this time.
Well, it's just, people are going to have opinions about what gods can or can't. This is actually, it's so funny. This is a similar conversation I've had to someone recently where we talked about, does a god love? Can a god love you? And that's a question for, probably that will never be answered ever in our lifetime, because there's so many different opinions about whether a god actually exists, whether many gods exist, and whether or not they do know that humans exist or give a shit that humans exist. You know what I mean? So this was a question that I posed to someone who we were having this really good conversation about. Miquella, which is, the person was saying he loves people. I'm like, well, but he abandons his love. Can a god love you once they've abandoned their humanity, what makes them able to love? I would say probably not. So, I don't know. This is just a topic I've talked about a few times of when you become a god in the world of Elden Ring, it seems like every part of you has been removed that makes you uniquely you. And Queen America is no exception to that. There are traces of who she once was, but after the acceptance of the Elden Ring and after her ascension, it seems like that person just completely disappears. and we get other people in her place doing the things that we think she wants to do, but how much of that is her own will? I mean, for goodness sakes, she's a part of, her outer god is the greater will, who could enforce his will upon her. We don't know. We don't know how that works, It's kind of all in the name, though, of your will. Is she still free to do her own things? Who knows? But I definitely fall into the category of American apologist, and I don't care what people say.
Solidarity.
Exactly. Like, what you understand, we're Queen America apologists, not the horrible actions or the genocide that she committed, but it does seem like godhood changes people, and Miquella was no exception to that, even though it seemed like he was trying to. It seems like he was, it says a lot in I think it's his Great Rune, or maybe it's the Remembrance, to become a different kind of god. But what does that mean? Was he trying to escape the control of the Elden Ring? Was he trying to escape the greater will's, will being put upon him? What was he trying to be different from Queen America? And all of those, I feel like, options kind of point in a direction. Because like you said, Queen America was a symbol of goodness to the people of the lands between for a very long time, of healing, of, this golden era, this golden age of prosperity. It's all in the eyes of who it affects. Same thing with a line from, I think it's Needle Knight Lita, who says they were never saints, they were just on the losing side of a war. And that's so true, right? Because we learned that the Hornsent did many bad things, a lot of really horrific things before the war against them. But does that justify what was done? I don't know. That's it's a little deep for me.
Yeah, and I think the fact that Elden Ring approaches it from an open-ended stance of, like, yes, Miquella is atoning for the sins of his mother, and Ymir, spits fire at Marika's existence, but Elden Ring leaves an open-ended take on what is observed, there's definitely the subsection of people that play the game and come away with it without any media literacy and are like, yes, Marika did nothing wrong, and she was totally right for all of this, despite Mesmer being, a fucked up guy after doing everything he did.
Oh, God. Her poor traumatized child.
Yeah. And it's it's the nuance of the cycle of violence. They want to present it in a condemnation of how it happens. Marika was probably in the moments of how it happened, Marika was understandable in her actions because real world genocide is justifiable, let alone fucking fictional genocide. If we're gonna get real with it, it's an anti-genocide message that's being told in the DLC. They use the very they use the very specific term of the Crusade, which harkens back to ancient, invasions of the Middle East, and then it's talking about, I don't know. It's depressing stuff. Hi, this is Gideon from the future chiming in because of her previously really poor elaboration and word choice, especially in the sense that I literally said genocide is justifiable, which in the context of what I'm talking about, I think it's clear what I'm trying to say is that genocide is justifiable by the people that do it, and they use it as a cover to the overall world so that they can continue doing what they do, unbothered and uncritiqued. But that is just such an important thing to clarify in my opinion that I just had to put in an omission here. I had to make this statement. And it's something that I think in today's modern times is more important than ever to clarify. And I think that's part of why I love Elden Ring as a piece of media, as a piece of art, because it so thoroughly tries to capture these real elements and themes and make an actual message out of them. Dark Souls 3 is a little bit anti-capitalist in a way, if you take a really extreme reading. And Elden Ring, you don't even have to go that radically in your interpretation. Like, the base game of Elden Ring tells a war is bad, a violence is bad message. The overall theme of Elden Ring is telling a message that no matter the benevolence of the state, no matter the benevolence of the ruler, whatever they do to achieve their own ends is going to be evil if it's done through conquest or domination. And in the DLC, we go beyond the anti-war message into an anti-genocide message. The Hornsent weren't simply warred upon by Mesmer; they were eliminated en masse. The remnants of their population in the Omen. I know it's a fantasy link, and there's a bit of like a curse going on, but the remnants of their population are contained, shunned, and discriminated against. We live in a real world today where places like Canada have had soft genocides and how they re-educate people. We live in a world today where there's active ongoing genocide. Like, to compare Elden Ring to another piece of media that does try to handle these same topics but very poorly, The Last of Us Part 2 is a game that was partially inspired by the Israeli Palestine conflict. Its director is a self declared Israelite. The two factions that are constantly in conflict are based off of Israel and Palestine, but the game has no actual self critique. It has no self awareness, and it completely portrays it from the Israeli side of the conflict, which is to say that the Seraphites are depicted as this religious fanatical group that constantly goes too far, constantly initiates violence, and that has to be put down by the end of the game, and most of them die. That's not a solution. It's a fictional solution maybe, but like you can see the issues of such media, and this is why I value Elden Ring and what it presents. I don't want to get too real or spend too much time talking about this. I mean, at the end of the day, Elden Ring is a piece of fiction that some people use as an escape from reality, and they deserve to be able to do that. I just wanted to explain my stance, explain my pro word choice, and I think that that explanation sort of warranted this broader exploration of the topic. Um, Maybe it'll be a good future episode. I don't want to get too heavy with it. So my apologies, and let's just get back to the episode. Thank you so much for sticking with me through this.
No, I definitely I agree. I agree. And I think we have to remember that Miyazaki is Japanese, and a Japanese person's perspective on genocide and war is going to look very different from perhaps some of ours, because they went through some really, really horrific, massive attacks during the World War II. And so it's going to look a little bit different from that perspective. I know that Hayao Miyazaki, the animator, the storyteller, he likes to play with a lot of those old memories as well. So, but you're right, it is a very anti-genocide, anti-war, because, like you said, revenge begets revenge, and it just is a cycle that continues over and over again. And that kind of harkens back to the Tarnished. I think it's the Memory of Grace, where it's all just a cycle, which is kind of depressing, but it's true, unfortunately.
Yeah. I think part of that is in the formless mother. I don't want to depict the formless mother as just like a one note purveyor of violence, but there's this idea of her coming to those people that are forsaken and embracing them, but like her embrace isn't something that is peaceful. It's violent. Not. It's not entirely violent. There's like I think the Sanguine Amaryllis item from the DLC mentions that there's a beauty born of the blood. Like even in this like mire of violence, there can be a flower that's beautiful. But in overall, the Formless Mother began with the Blood Fiends. These people who were violently oppressed either by Bellerad itself or by Mesmer later on, and they came to worship the Formless Mother by looking at like this misshapen, destroyed husk of I don't know what it is. It just talks about like a corpse or something in the item description. And from that, they get bigger. They're almost like omen proportioned. And then later on, the Bellaret people are oppressed, completely forsaken. And you see these omen born during the Golden Order who are like this merging of the horn scent and the omen. And they too eventually go to the Formless Mother with Mogh, which I think is, like it's about the cycle of violence and bloodthirst. Like the knight that you fight to save Kenneth Height's fort has very pointlessly slaughtered a bunch of demi-humans to capture a fort that has no strategic value because he's obsessed with violence, and then you go and kill him and you get a blood ash of war from it because he's obsessed with violence, I guess.
That's interesting. I never thought about that. I didn't harken back to that far, that early in the game.
That is valid. Yeah, it's a bit of a vague connection.
I was like, hey, that is a very unique point of evidence, but hey, it's a good one. I'm glad that you brought up the Formless Mother, because I think one thing that really interested me a lot about the Formless Mother is that she seems to be one of a few, but she seems to be the most prominent of the outer gods. I use air quotes because, who knows how many outer gods and which ones are actually outer gods and which ones aren't. But the Formless Mother has a direct tie to the Land of Shadow. That means that she's very ancient, very old, and has the worship of blood and the worship of her have been around for so incredibly long. And it does pose the question of, how did Mogh find her? And why did Mogh find her? I think for me, there seem to be like these gears turning in the back of my mind of Miquella's charm on Mogh, and perhaps its effect on him and when it was affected. Because a lot of people seem to think that he was only affected after he gained Miquella, after he went to the Haligtree, procured him, and then brought him back to his palace. But if we think about it in terms of why would Mogh even do that in the first place, I think we realize that Mogh probably was charmed much, much earlier in the story than that. If he had suddenly gained this want or desire to go and take Miquella away from the Haligtree, why would he do that if he was not already charmed? And then you look at the Formless Mother. Why did he find the Formless Mother? What does she give him? What does she provide him? And is she this waypoint between the Land of Shadow and the lands between? Because we see that similarity between her and the fell god of the fire giants. I think it's the furnace visage that's on the furnaces, that says that it's the face of the fell god that terrorized the horn sense, because that was the fire that kills them, body and soul. If I'm correct, I think I'm right, but I could be wrong.
No, I remember that. It's like it's one of the fire knights. He revives people with Mesmer's flame, and it leaves them soulless. And then later we learn that the frenzied flame destroys souls, and Midra lives in the abyssal woods. So there's definitely a connection to be made there.
Mm-hmm. But I think the bigger thing too is that where does that leave us with Miquella? Why did Miquella want Mogh specifically? And we know that Sir Ansbach tells us that he uses Lord Mogh to gain entry to the Land of Shadow. How does he do this? We know that Mogh is slaughtering people. He's making a lake of blood. He's making these gigantic pools down below, and it's affecting so many things around this area. Was it the Formless Mother's connection to the Land of Shadow that allowed Miquella to seemingly travel there? Or was it just simply his death? I think that there is an argument for maybe both, because it doesn't seem as easy as just death. If Miquella wanted to get there and just wanted to die, he could have done it so much easier. But it seems like he had a specific plan for Mogh to help him gain entrance to the Land of Shadow. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I've like approached it from a couple of different angles in my mind, because one of the things that sticks out to me is that based off of the promotional footage, and I guess we can't say for certain if that's lore friendly, but I would assume it is. Like, it's like the story trailer. I assume that everything we learn about the whole womb and America and Golden Shadow, like, that's supposed to be taken as lore. That's in game. So based off of that, we see Miquella go to the Land of Shadow on Torrent, which we know that he would have had to do before the Shattering War since Melina gets Torrent. So what would the function of him visiting be if that's to be taken as a literal lore thing? And if it's not, then I'm not sure. But like, going past that, we also have to look at like we see Devonia, who allegedly visited the Land of Shadow. We can assume that Mesmer's genocide was the point that the veil over Bellarat was placed. I
Right.
assume the Shadow Tree would have been growing alongside that, but I don't know how big it would have been or at what point it would have converted the entirety of the Land of Shadow. Because it seems like that probably would have happened at the outset of Marika doing her whole golden threads thing. Because you see like this sort of like golden part inside of the Divine Gate and then shadow on the outside.
Mm-hmm.
I know I'm going a lot of different directions.
No,
It's
it's
just
okay.
like the metaphysical aspects of the Land of Shadow are like legitimately confusing because it's the center of the lands between that was made into a demi-plane of death where the quasi afterlife where death gathers. So
Mm-hmm.
souls go there when they die, but you can visit there because Devonia goes there and she seems to just be alive. And Miquella might have visited on Torrent before everything happened, but afterwards we see like this clear idea of Ansbach literally saying that Miquella needed Mogh's corpse to get to the Land of Shadow, and it's likely that whatever he did with Mogh's corpse is like left with his own corpse because you touch the withered arm to go to the Land of Shadow, and assumedly all of the other knights of Miquella, like companions, do.
Right. Mm-hmm.
I
No,
don't know how.
I was going to say, so it's interesting that you bring that up because once again, it kind of ties back to the blood topic of it because we see in that cutscene before we battle Mogh, Mogh's dripping down the withered arm as this like strange pool of blood. And he just comes out of this blood. Where was he? Was he in the Land of Shadow? I think that it does kind of connect this idea between the Mother of Truth, the accursed blood, and this almost like entryway into the Land of Shadow. And is that how he got there? Because we know that Mogh can thrust his arm into her body by like opening this bloody pool, weird portal in the sky, and then throw her blood all over you. That's kind of one of his moves. So it's interesting to think of that he comes out of another pool of blood and just appears as if he's come from a different realm. And I think that that kind of goes hand in hand, like you said, with his corpse, with his death. He needed him for obvious reasons. We know why he used his corpse. But at the same time, I think he was also using a lot of Mogh's abilities and his connection with the Formless Mother to find that pathway to get into the Land of Shadow. Without, because, you know, we know that death doesn't come to people anymore in the lands between. Destined death has been removed. The rune of death is pulled away. So how do we get to a sealed off Land of Shadow where death is supposed to go to if we can't successfully, you know, die in a way that we're supposed to be able to truly do? And it seems like Miquella and Mogh kind of cracked the code, and I just kind of wanted to pick your brain about that because I find that to be a very interesting point.
I completely agree. I guess one aspect of it that might be important to consider before we go too deep is that the pool of blood that Mogh rises out of is something that the Sanguine nobles do as well. I think the ones in
Mm-hmm.
the mausoleum are infinitely respawning from those pools of blood. Whether it's the same guy or just a new dude every time, I guess is somewhat open to personal interpretation. But like based off of that, I feel like it's even comparable to how the furled fingers from the two fingers can make people get summoned because you sort of come out of the pool in a similar way of rising from this sort of portal. It's just much more bloody in the Sanguine Assassins in Mogh's case.
Right.
And you even do it through the power of a cursed finger. Like when you invade people, you're using a severed finger or your own finger.
Mm-hmm.
Um But I think that you're definitely right. I think there's something about the formless mother, or about Mogh's omen horns, which would be like horns sent, divine
Mm-hmm.
horns,
Right.
that
Mm-hmm.
connects him to the land of shadow, which is specifically connected to the formless mother, as well as the crucible, which has its whole refinement being represented in horns. Hmm.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, and I think that Miquella was, along with charming, he was also very I don't know if inquisitive is the right term, but he wanted to learn as much because it everything seems to mention how he wanted to know what happened, and it mentions this original sin and him wanting to atone for it, and so he was very inquisitive once he entered the land of shadow. I don't know if he just didn't know what he was supposed to expect when he got there. And I don't even know how he really found out about the land of shadow to begin with. So that's kind of like a whole other topic to kind of get into.
Yeah, it really is. Maybe we'll have to do another episode.
I was gonna say, yeah.
I guess to leave it though, like with is that you find Saint Trina flowers, Miquella lilies, and sacramental buds everywhere across the lands between, and all of them have like a specific connection to Miquella. Which, I mean, the sacramental buds are also found in places where Mogh's blood followers go, but like,
Hmm.
going off of the idea that Miquella bewitched Mogh and that he's connected to the blood and using the power of a curse, like there's a through line there.
Right.
But like,
Hmm.
it indicates that he was exploring almost everywhere in the lands between prior to the Shattering War, which I think really reinforces your whole idea of his inquisitiveness. And
Yeah, I
yeah.
didn't even think about it in that terms, but it makes sense why he landed down into the depths because we know that they're. I mean, one of the first things you find in the Land of Shadow are the silver flies, which say they only grow underground, but you're in the Land of Shadow. So definitely means that there's a significance to his pool of blood kind of being there at that specific spot under the ground in this area. And we know that Queen Marika sealed so many different things underground. Seems like anything the Greater Will didn't want, it was sent underground time and time again. So, but yeah, I think that there's a lot more to do with the blood between Miquella and Mogh, their curse, them both being cursed in different ways, and the way that it affects them. But I mean, it's such an interesting topic. There's so many different routes to go, though. Too many
Mm-hmm.
routes.
Yeah. Okay, so like, so that we don't get too spread thin, maybe we should hop into a more focused topic. And who did Miquella enchant? We've talked about Mogh. So do you have any further thoughts you'd like to share about the sort of timeline that you see in Mogh's charm? Because, like you mentioned earlier, it's likely that it's possible that Mogh came to the conclusion of Miquella being a source of godhood himself, but it feels more in line with Miquella's sort of cunning, underhanded planning. I don't want to describe him as like underhanded as bad, but he definitely has an amount of cunning to him. And it makes
Definitely.
sense that if he like recognized the Haligtree as failing, and he saw in Mogh an avenue to the land of shadow and his next project in becoming god, it stands to reason that you could say that he charmed Mogh with the goal of Mogh taking him away from the Haligtree. I just wonder if this seems like something that you've researched in detail, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I don't know about too much detail, but I have a lot of thoughts. Just over the fact that it seems like time. I mean, timelines are hard to do for Elden Ring, but in the timeline of Miquella charming Mogh, there seems to be a lot of evidence pointing at the fact that he charmed him much earlier in the story than we maybe once thought. Again, if it was as simple as Miquella just dying to go to the Land of Shadow, he might have just let himself die. But I think somebody said something about nascency, and I can't remember the quote, but basically this idea of being just stuck. You're stuck at a beginning and you can never end, but you can also never progress. And that's what an end comes to, is when you can progress. And Miquella is trapped in this unprogressible, unmoving form. So he can't ever really get to another area, or he can't get to his goal. That's kind of the whole idea that a few people have had about the Haligtree failing, is everything he kind of puts himself into, it can never progress past a certain point, because his curse, a part of being eternally youthful, is also being in this nascent form of never being able to go beyond, almost seeming like you just were born, right? You just started, but it can never finish. Whereas Mogh's connection, like you talked about, his divine horns, which in the lands between are omens, seem to connect him to the land of shadow, whether he knows it or not. And then it seems like Miquella somehow found that out and was able to use him to successfully move past that nascency, that inability to progress forward, that inability to die, essentially. It's something I talked about in my Miquella abandonment video, which was just, I think, even like 2 weeks before the DLC came out, I posted it. And it was something I posed the question of, is Miquella actually dead? Is that body of his in the cocoon dead? And I think it's safe to say, yes, it is dead. He's not in it. It's been abandoned by him, and everything else has been abandoned by him as well. So I think that he used Mogh specifically to gain his goals once he probably realized the Haligtree was not going to work. Who knows how long he was stuck in that tree, unfortunately. We don't have a good timeline. I think people think that things happened a lot faster than maybe they did. But he could have been stuck in the Haligtree for a really long time before realizing, this is not happening because I am cursed, because my blood is cursed, because my mother is cursed. Wherever the curse comes from, I am not able to progress forward, and so therefore I need to find another way to progress forward. And then perhaps he was able to charm Mogh. I don't know. That's kind of my guess.
That's a really interesting idea. I've gone back and forth in my idea of how I see the sort of nascency of Miquella, because I do like the idea, and I think it's really clever to go back to the butterflies that have so much to do with all of the characters that they're associated with. Like, even Mesmer gets a black firefly in the
which is
DLC.
so cool. I was so excited about.
I know, I love it. I guess, like, I looked it up, and the Haligtree Crust Great Shield reads, metal great shield depicting the Haligtree with unalloyed gold, carried by knights who have vowed to serve Miquella's Haligtree. Yet now, with the Haligtree misshapen, this wondrous rendition is a fleeting fantasy. And I guess one of the reasons I hesitate to say, like, this is because of Miquella's nascency that it failed, is because Elden Ring as a whole depicts a lot of people just sort of failing. Like, I don't think that, like... yeah, like, I don't want to, like, I guess, like,
bunch of losers.
Yeah, get it together, guys. But yeah, like, how much of the Haligtree failed because of the inherent rot to millennia? How much of that is carried in the narrative of Miquella, quote-unquote, abandoning millennia? Like, even if he always wanted to return, would he have been able to? Is that one of the sacrifices people just have to make? Is that a problem? And I guess I don't know. I mean, what do you feel about that? Like, I don't know how married you are to the nascency theory, because I'm back and forth on it,
Well, I mean, I really like that theory. In my opinion, it does kind of make sense in a lot of ways, and we see it in so many different examples. Miquella's knight sword, I think it is, has never seen a knight. It's an unfortunate sword that has never been wielded. Even though we know the Haligtree has knights, Miquella's never had a knight. Whereas, same thing with Ranni. Ranni was given a shadow, but Miquella was never given a shadow. It seems kind of to run side by side by more of his story. I'm not completely married to the idea, but I do like the idea because it explains a lot of his setbacks without it being too simplified. Because we run into this problem where it's like, well, why did the Haligtree fail? Oh, because millennia rotted it to death, unfortunately. But Melania at the roots is fine. She's not rotted away. And the roots are clean, and his husk is still intact. So we see that the Haligtree kind of was able to almost, get rid of and spurn a little bit of the rot itself, retaining some of his abilities, and some of that unalloyed gold, repression of the outer gods kind of sense. I don't think unalloyed gold can completely destroy the effects of outer gods, but it definitely has the ability to kind of forestall it. And we see that in the roots of the Haligtree. So I don't know if it's as simple as Melania's rottiness and her blooms destroyed it, because we don't see the rot affecting the roots where she's sitting, where it should be affecting it the most. Instead, we see it on the very, very outer parts of it where it's kind of already dying. And when a tree dies, a lot of the times the roots are the last to completely die. You can a lot of the times cut off a lot of the dead of a tree and restart again with good, healthy roots that still remain. So I think more in terms of that kind of makes sense for me, but I don't know. I could be wrong. I don't know what the interpretation is for Miyazaki when it comes to the Haligtree's failure.
Yeah, I totally get that. And I think that, like, I'm not sure if I ever really like just settling on one idea or the other, because it's just interesting to explore, and I feel like that's more the intention of what they want, because we really can't know what the authorial intent was at the end of the day.
Absolutely.
I like the nascency idea, and it's something that I had thought of. I remember before the DLC even dropped, when you look at the Empyreans that were born under Marika's reign, and you imagine, like, the possibility of, did Marika maybe at some point want to choose a successor for herself? You see, you've got the fun little fan theory that Ranni might have been intended to marry Godwyn as a union between sun and moon, and you see the literal, like, rejection of godhood that she has in the fact that she kills Godwyn and goes down the dark path of the Empyrean. And, Melania's great rune is most similar to Marika's. She's most likely Marika's only true-born daughter that we, like, hear about, outside of Melina, but, like, Melena's a special case because she's seemingly hidden from history. Like, she's either the Glum-Eyed Queen, which people really like as a theory, or she's someone who was just born very close to the Shattering War and was kept out of, public eye. But either way, like, you have this idea that all of the Empyreans under Marika's reign were born with some specific reason they couldn't be queen. Ranni didn't want it, Millennia was rotted, Melina had a vision of fire, and Miquella was eternally youthful. So whatever part of his eternal youth prevented godhood. So I think the angle of him rejecting his body, rejecting his Empyrean blood, which carries the curse of eternal youth, and that being part of what springboarded him into entering the Divine Gate, it seems very reasonable to me. So I like the nascency aspect in that. I guess my hesitation is how much of the nascency do I want to apply to everything in the game, and how much is like, because it just goes back and forth. I guess not to talk too much about it.
No, it's okay. I was gonna say, like, and again, you can always apply it to things that make sense. I think one of the things that we maybe, especially in the lore community, do that kind of is to our detriment is somebody gets a really, really good connection, and then you want to connect everything to that connection. It's like, okay, well, that was a really good connection between those things. It doesn't mean it works for every single thing. And I think that's okay, because then it starts to become redundant of like everything Miquella did is nascency. He's, nothing will grow and he will never this, and his blood and his tree and his sister and his friends and his knights and his, it's a little too much at a certain point. It's like, okay, we get it, nascency. But I do like it in terms of the really big ideas of Miquella's failing. I mean, so many times it's almost like rubbing it in his face, but so many of the different descriptions say Haligtree that failed to become an Erd-tree. It failed. It's like a big fat failure just shoved in his face over and over. But I do think that there's a point it's trying to make, is that it shouldn't have failed. There shouldn't have been a good enough reason why it failed. It just did, because it always was going to. At least that's kind of what I get from it. I don't think Miquella's Haligtree was ever going to succeed. But, To each their own, to each their own.
Oh, I mean, I really like it. I think that, even outside of the nascency theory, which I think is like on point, I think that saying the Haligtree was never going to succeed is definitely a worthy claim to make, especially considering how we see it, how it ends. Or yeah, um, I agree. I think that's really well said about like the lore community in general, like connections and
Mm-hmm.
whatnot.
Yeah, because even I found the winged helm description. Melania awaited Miquella at the foot of the husk. It's just called a husk at the end. It's so
Yeah,
sad.
and you literally see like as you walk through it, it's entirely
Mm-hmm.
hollow almost. Like part of the bark where Elphael is built, it's just gone. Elphael is
Right.
built to be like a literal brace for the Haligtree.
Because it's just hollow inside. Yeah. So I think that that's kind of a metaphor. But go ahead. I don't want to take too much time on this topic.
No, you're totally fine. I like I said before we even started, I love the freeform discussion that can arise from it, even if we don't fully get to all of the topics. But also, in the vein of trying to get to all of the topics, I think it might be worthwhile to talk about Miquella's followers that we meet in the DLC and the different reasons they follow him. Like we know that they're charmed. Like that's very clear. Ansbach, for instance, probably never wanted to follow Miquella, but was just completely overwhelmed by whatever magic that, compulsions that Miquella wields. But then we have other
Mm-hmm.
characters like Leda or Dane, who very actively sort of seek out his loyalty. Like, I think Leda wears the Oathseeker Knight armor, sort of like a variation of it with her cloak, and the
Mm-hmm.
Oathseeker Knight armor so it reads something along the lines of they're people who seek loyalty, they want to make oaths, that's like their
Right. They're
purpose.
looking for their cause.
Yeah, exactly, and she founds a cause in Miquella. Or like we see in Dain that the Dryleaf sect saw the end of the Erdtree, and we also see that they were awaiting something new, and we further understand sort of the emotional disposition of Dain as someone who's taken an oath of silence in his, I think it's his hat item description, which reads something along the lines of how he was afraid to meet people's eyes, like look people in the eye, because he was afraid of the human connection and how it might break his vow of silence. And we see someone who's like supposed to reject human connection almost, but craves the love of Miquella. And
Yeah,
I don't know, like yeah.
that's interesting. I was gonna say because you can kind of see an in between point with like Tialie, not so hardcore as Lita and Dane, but even he is rejecting this idea of ever wanting to kill Miquella because even though he's in love with Saint Trina, even though he even wonders if Miquella will, punish him for wanting to be with Saint Trina, wanting to gaze upon her while she's the discarded half. When we go through the quest line and after telling him what she tells us, he curses you. At first, he curses you because he wants to be the only chosen one, but secondly, it's after you tell him she wants you to kill Miquella, and he says that can't be. That's like he almost rejects it outwardly of no, this cannot be right. Miquella and Saint Trina were supposed to be one. There's no way that she would want him dead. So I think even he kind of straddles this fence between am I against Miquella or am I with Miquella? And I think that's why in some cases he's not a full-fledged helper. I found out through a friend of mine playing the game at the same time that there's some instances that you don't get Tialie as a summon companion, as a summoner. And that's because you don't finish his quest line and he just doesn't show up. And I'm like, oh, well, that kind of confirms this idea of him not like Sir Ansbach, who once the charm breaks, he's like, no, Miquella is my enemy. He is a monster. He has done terrible things to my master and to me. There's a juxtaposition between that and Lita, but then also you see the straddling of Tialie's character as well.
Yeah, and even in that sense, like you have that very early dialogue with Leda where she, after the charm breaks, she is wondering who of all the followers is most dangerous to their cause. And you can recommend Tolier, but she says, oh, I know about his obsession with Saint Trina, but he'd never be a problem because Saint Trina would never wish harm upon Miquella. And, like, you see that in, like, Tolier's own reaction. He doesn't believe it at first, but once he accepts it, he does become a danger. You know, like...
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think that's interesting. And I think, again, it kind of harkens back to what we talked about earlier of Miquella kind of choosing to charm people who maybe it didn't even need to be charmed because they were followers of his already. And so maybe that kind of points and lends its hand to the idea that Miquella can't always control his charm, that it's just a thing that happens. But I don't know. Yeah, I find that really interesting. All I can say is I love the NPCs for the DLC. They're all so cool. And I was really excited to see how many there were. I was like, oh my gosh, there's people everywhere, like every 2 seconds.
I think that final NPC fight with Leda and her allies is my favorite, just from the DLC in terms of
I was
narrative.
so betrayed. I was like, no, you guys, we were all supposed to be friends.
I know, right? It's so sad, but it's so narratively compelling.
I was so mad. I was just sitting on the couch like, how dare you guys turn on me?
I guess from their point of view, you turned on them, to be fair.
We were never on Miquella's side. I think that's something people have to remember, because I think so many fans are so loyal to Miquella. They love Miquella. They love his character. They would if they could have been on his side. But we are the Lord of the Elden Ring, of the Erdtree. We are Ranni's Lord, but we're not Miquella's Lord. We're not on his side. We never were on his side. So technically they just find out that we secretly were never one of them.
Literally. I love how they even mention that. They're like, was it Miquella or the Erdtree that guided you here?
I was like, oh my gosh, you're right.
Yeah.
No, he didn't guide me here. I've been a liar this whole time. I was a liar to them, and I was a liar to myself. How could you?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I love the dramaticism about it. Like, the light of Miquella you get from the remembrance is like, Miquella sought to accept all that was and would be, but found one that refused to be embraced. No wonder.
Mm-hmm. We're so dramatic, our character. We belong in a soap opera. And it's great. That's kind of what Elden Ring turns into. This family and all of their messed up kids and all of their crazy problems.
Literally. Who would have expected it with George Martin writing the backstory?
It is right up his alley. I loved the NPCs. I did love seeing the addition to the charming. Once the charm broke too, I remember just squealing, being like, yes, I knew it. He's been charming people. I was way too excited about him capturing my heart.
You deserve that.
Yeah, and when he does it during the boss fight, I was like, oh my gosh, I knew it.
I think I sent that screenshot to 4 people. I was so excited for it.
When he hugs you.
Yeah.
I was like, no, not the hugs.
I don't want it.
Just yelling the whole time. I mean, that fight was so ridiculously hard. It was incredibly difficult for me. I don't know why. But the whole time I just run screaming the other way, like, no hugs, no.
Stay back. Yeah. I'd say that's probably one of the hardest fights in the game. Probably second hardest or something, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think what was hard for me was, what's hard about Malenia is that she heals. And when she heals, she heals herself off of hurting you. But with Radon, it was his second half for me. It was just all that holy damage. You're having to... I'm a dodger. I'm not very good at parrying, so I'm really good at memorizing patterns. And so learning his attack pattern, in that second half, it's same attack pattern, except there's extra moves in between that are holy damage that would come striking you from the sky. And I was like, you know what? This is ridiculous. How am I supposed to dodge any of this? So yeah, that fight was hard.
Very hard. Not only are the AoEs roll catchy, but they also sort of just block out the entire screen.
Yeah, I was telling a few people in the other Discord, just every time he would jump into the air for a meteor, I just run screaming in any direction, like no, just run, because he would affect the whole screen.
Yeah, pray to God, but not to the Miquellan one.
Right, exactly. The wrong God.
Yeah. I guess, what other characters were enchanted? One thing not to completely change topic, but, Freya is such a compelling character to me, because she sort of does the inverse of what you'd expect from a character quest. Like, she wouldn't serve Miquella unless you told her Miquella was reviving Radahn, and then she chooses to. So she's sort of like, oh, Miquella didn't need to charm her. Or like, if he had just said what he was going to do, she would have followed him, but I don't know. Sorry, I'm still on the idea of who he enchanted, I guess.
No, that's fine. I actually really like that aspect about her. I think it's the same with Sir Moore, too, isn't it? Like, if you encourage him and tell him to let go, he sides with Lita and them. And I think it's if you tell him to just be sad forever, he doesn't, because he's, I don't know, depressed? I'm not sure if that's accurate. Yeah, he can't move on. And so, same thing with Redmane Freya, is if you help her by telling her all these different things and giving her this note from Sir Ansbach, who also is helping her, well, then she turns on both of you. I was like, oh, well, dang. Now I know not to help you out.
Yeah. It's such a fun and, like, reversal of Freya, who's, like, you know, she's sort of, like, almost a Soleil character. She's sort of this buff warrior who's like, hey, let's fight stuff together. And then you realize that she doesn't care what she's fighting. Like, if it's gonna be you, then she's gonna fight you too, like
she's okay with that. And that kind of goes hand in hand with this idea that is Miquella's age of compassion a lie? Because Radahn is a warlord. He's a general. He is a warrior. He fights. And Redmane Freya, just like you said, doesn't really matter who she fights, just wants to fight. And he takes after, what's his name? Godfrey, thank you. I almost said Gideon. I was like, that's not right. I'm reading your name. He takes after Godfrey, who is this, you know, warlord without a better word for that. I think he's a warlord. I don't know. He's her husband, but he's also going off fighting all these many different wars endlessly just to get spurned at the end. So there's really no real good reason for him doing it. And it kind of seems like Radahn's following that same path with Miquella of, I'm just going to kill just to kill, and I'm just kind of a killing machine because war. And Redmane Freya is kind of a good example of that. Like you said, I don't care who I fight as long as I'm fighting, and as long as you're a good opponent. I think that's what she says. Like, I couldn't have asked for a better opponent, which respect, but I'm pretty sure Godfrey says something very similar, doesn't he? At the end, when he says, like, you were worthy of the crown, or something like that. Like, your strength
befits a crown.
Yes. So he kind of does the same thing as Freya. So it kind of ties back Radahn and Godfrey's kind of connection between this warrior mindset of it's okay to be violent because whoever is the strongest deserves to be on top. And that kind of clashes with Miquella's compassion age, because that doesn't really sound very compassionate, but who knows?
Yeah, it's a very rule of beasts sort of thing.
It's so archaic. It is. It's very like caveman, survival of the fittest type kind of ideals.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you use caveman, because I feel like that's where like the core difference between Marika and Miquella is. I feel like like all of their goals at the end of the day are very similar. They want to ensure an age of peace and prosperity that will never end because they, a benefactor and very powerful god, will protect the people. But they can't
Mm-hmm.
see the mistakes of their own actions. And I feel like for America, it's almost more justifiable her position on the matter because she's born into the rule of beasts. She's born into like the prehistoric caveman era where a lot of the strongest things in the land were probably pretty violent. I think you see that like somewhere in Rao it talks about how the horned predators would actively eat lesser horned beasts just for
Right.
sport. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you can see a very clear reason why America might want to try and make a refined crucible out of the Erd tree and limit that. And you see how she's just wrong for doing it because everything, even if it was maybe arguably good at first, which it probably wasn't, because literally the Erd tree is described as being born into an age of war where Godfrey was conquering the world. Like,
Mm-hmm.
even if you do see that as a good time because of the prosperity, then you can't say it was good overall because everything rubber bands back into being worse than before.
Right.
Yeah, things get really bad because of the Shattering War, and maybe if nothing had been done in the first place, things could have been better. And you get that a little bit with, like, the Spiral and Bellarat. Like, what could have been achieved if gods hadn't meddled in human affairs or something, whatever.
Yeah, I definitely get what you're saying. It's true because Miquella, there's such a point in so many of his descriptions saying he wants to be different, but it's like you're kind of treading the same path. So I don't know how different you are. If you have a warlord as your consort who idolized the previous warlord of the previous god, who you're trying to be different from. So, and I don't know. It's kind of a good juxtaposition between the two, and I like what you said about America being born in this age of violence because as we can see, the Land of Shadow, it was very violent. We talked about the blood fiends, but we didn't even touch on the shaman. There's so many, it seems like, people in the Land of Shadow who were suppressed even before Messmer's rule there, and who were oppressed by the Horn Sense. And it doesn't justify violence, and it doesn't just justify revenge and genocide, but for her, I do genuinely think she believed it was a cleansing. This is all bad, so instead of trying to fix it, I'm just going to burn it all away and start new, which is kind of what she did. I think Miquella is trying to say, oh, I can fix it. But I think he loses that message a little bit. I don't know. Do you have an idea of what Miquella's core message would be? Because I find it to be kind of ironic because he says, an age, 1,000 years of compassion, while Radon is trying to kill us with his swords and swinging and battling us like a madman. So I find that to be kind of maybe not true. But what do you think?
I think that's one of those things where it's okay. It's weird, and I guess I'll just be upfront with saying that I think I spoke a little bit of it before, but I feel like Miquella and Radon as well, to some extent, are hurt as characters in their personal narratives by what the DLC tries to present by using them as parallels to America and Godfrey to reinforce because I think what they're doing with the theme is reinforcing the overall message of rejecting the easy answer of the Golden Age and the God King, and the idea that someone can save the world by knowing what to do and doing it better. I wrote this video about Bellarat, and I dove into Taoism while doing it because I feel like there's a lot of Eastern philosophy influences. Like we literally see the dragon dance
Right.
in the
Mm-hmm.
Divine Dancing Beast. So going through that, I looked up a lot of ancient Chinese mythology, starting with ancestor worship and how that evolved into Confucianism. And Confucianism isn't. It's already that's way simplistic. Confucianism took aspects of ancestor worship, and eventually you get Taoism. And one of the things about Confucianism, Taoism, and all of that stuff is that they're not religions the same way that like Christianity is a religion exactly. Like Confucianism was added to the world religion like list in a conference during the 20th century, I think. And it was done so because it was sort of pervasively it had a lot of mirrored aspects of what we associate with religion in the West. But overall it was more of like a state philosophy that a lot of like state bureaucrats would have. um, and I'm just explaining this because under Taoism, there's this idea of Wu Wei, which is, I like quote unquote going with the flow. Like if you read like a self-help book and they bring up Wu Wei, they're probably going to talk about how you have to accept good and bad luck for yourself and learn to just roll with the punches and not assume your own idea of morality onto the world. But
Mm-hmm.
in the overall sense of it, it's sort of a criticism of excessive use of force by the state because there's this idea that it sort of ties into as above, so below. And, you know, Elden Ring does that a lot with its imagery. We even have this Ymir wants to create a microcosm. And in the idea of as above, so below, you have the macrocosm, which is the cosmos, like the overarching rules of the universe. And
Right.
those are shown in the microcosm of humans. Like every human is a microcosm of the macrocosm. And Ymir wants to make like a perfect microcosm because he believes that that will let him commune with the greater will, which we know that it does because Matir did it that way. And I guess I'm just going all into this because you know of the connections. But overall, Wu Wei is this idea that by interfering with the world and trying to put your own image onto it, you will probably end up messing up the way that the natural cycles of it work because your own limited idea of morality, of right and wrong, or good and bad, or benignity or malignity, is going to not be all encompassing and it's going to fail. And you know, it could even like not following Wu Wei could even result in like a violent death because maybe you tried to run away from joining the army because you were scared and you end up getting killed by bandits on the road when you leave town. You know, like uh I don't know. I think I guess like through that lens, at least to me, I feel like when you see Miquella trying to become a god, when you see Marika's failure as a god, and you see Ranni's ending as rejecting godhood, it's this idea of like the Elden Ring should never have been on Earth. The
Mm-hmm.
fact that gods are interfering with the world is like if God itself is breaking Wu Wei, which is the natural function of the world, then everything's broken. And by removing that, Bronny's right, and maybe that's why the Greater Will abandoned things. Maybe it realized that too. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I
Uh,
think that was I was gonna say that kind of ties back to what I was saying about Ronnie and this idea of free will or just allowing things to happen. And there's a lot of different ways that we can interpret it. A really prominent one in the Western world is this idea of your future will always happen, and the things that you do to try to prevent it will only make it happen faster or only make it more sure that it will happen. Have you heard of that before? It's kind of this prophecy idea.
yeah, like you know, in the trying to
The
avoid
self.
your fate, you run right to
Exactly.
it.
So
Yeah.
I feel like Miquella kind of does fall into that line of he's trying to become a different god, and yet he looks almost exactly like what we had pictured Marika. And he seems to have picked a consort who emulates Marika's consort. And it seems like this, you know, weird way he's kind of just self-fulfilled this prophecy of that he will not make a new god. He can try, but he's not going to because godhood will always be what it'll be. It's a prison. It is what it is kind of a situation. Whereas Ronnie, I think, kind of knows that and is like, I just don't want any part of it. I want, if there's gonna be an order, it's not gonna be this, and rejects this idea of individual godness and rejects this idea of having a consort. Even she just kind of wants to, it'll be what it'll be. And like we said, and like I brought up earlier, who knows how much time has gone in between and how much work was done in between these big, large, long events that happened in the lands between, because the Shattering War was not quick. It was not something that happened super quick. It was something that took a lot of time, and it involved pretty much almost every single region, except for, I guess, Raya Lucaria, since they were doing their own thing. But it kind of just puts into perspective this idea of trying to force something to happen versus letting it go. And then it just happening to you anyways, which is Ranni's side of the coin, versus Miquella trying to force it to try and happen, trying to, do all these different things. If I can just make an Erd tree, I can become a god. If I can just get to the land of shadow, I can become a god. If I just get rid of my body, I can become a no god. And trying to force all these things, but in the end, he ends up becoming almost identical to his mother. And it's kind of sad. It's definitely, like we said earlier, kind of depressing, this thought.
Yeah, it's a very tragic, he wanted to do good and he couldn't. And he couldn't even realize, when he was confronted with his own personal doubts, rather than, listening to his inner self, he just abandoned that.
He got rid of them, which I think is I found that so interesting that I don't know if you thought this as well, but when you come across all the crosses, at first it's mostly just his physical form, but I really liked the addition of his inner feelings. Because feelings, are metaphysical. They're not really something that's tangible. You can't touch love or touch fear, but we all feel it and we all know it. And he says, I abandon here my love. I abandon here my fear, my doubts, my indecision, all these different things. He's abandoning it. And it kind of was, I remember getting through all of those and being like, oh, you probably shouldn't have left this one behind. Oh, you definitely shouldn't have left that one behind. Oh my gosh, you're just letting it all go, aren't you? Like, this is kind of what gives us, the ability to see right from wrong, to have a moral compass, to understand and love and to accept and to forgive and all these different things. You can't do that when you get rid of all your emotions as well. So again, like, that was one of the bigger things that I kept talking about with somebody in the community was, can a god love? And Miquella, is he still able to? And it's pretty obvious that the answer is no. And it just harkens back to that. But I loved that addition of seeing all his different crosses and seeing all the different parts of himself, not just physical, that he was giving up as well. And it kind of gave this little bit of like foreboding. I was like, oh, I don't think this is going to be good. Like, every time we'd find a new one, I'd be like, probably shouldn't have given that one up. And the little ghost that says you gave up a part of yourself that you shouldn't have when it comes to Saint Trina. I love that. I thought that was really fun. I know you kind of brought up this idea of him and Radon being a little watered down because of the fact that they're so similar, and it kind of takes from their characters a little bit. And I definitely don't disagree with that. But I think that the way that we progressed his story in the DLC, I liked. I know a lot of people said that they didn't enjoy the ending of the DLC, but I personally liked the progression of it. I thought it was pretty good. I liked the path that we followed. I found it very interesting.
I agree. I really like the Miquella crosses. They're very poignant. Like, the Saint Trina ones, I just love for the reasons you said. And I think the one I like most of all is, I abandon all my fear right before... Like, that's the last one you find. Mm-hmm. That was right before he took the plunge. And it just feels very impactful that's your build-up. It does add that layer of foreboding anticipation as you approach the final boss in the Divine Gate.
Mm-hmm. And I think about it in this sense, too. If he's removing all of these different things, is that all he was left with? Is that all he was at the end before we get to him was fear? I think that says something. I think that's kind of poignant to point out that even though he was on this goal-oriented mission, he had done so much, even at the very end, his last cross, the last piece of him he abandoned, was his fear, because that's all that was left of him. I find that very interesting. I don't know what that says about the story per se, but it's something that stuck out to me, just like it stuck out to you.
Yeah, it's very impactful. And I agree about the progression of the story too. Like I said, I think that the NPCs are some of my favorite parts. Sekiro is my favorite game in the series, and it's by far the most narratively driven. And I was really happy to see more of that in the DLC. The fights where you can summon people and they just spend a full minute shouting at the boss are my favorites.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I agree. I have a friend of mine who is like, he's kind of a purist. No summons, no this, no that. And I was like, oh, there's no way, because I absolutely love hearing the summons when they were talking to each other, when they were talking to the bosses, you know, Sir Ansbach talking to Radon, or Egon talking to Bale. I was like, oh my gosh, these are so cool. This is what I live for. I was like, this makes the battle so much more endurable, even though it's super hard.
It really heightens it. It makes it so much more fun.
Yes, I agree. I agree. And it makes it like you said, it's that human interaction. It's that narrative story. I loved the narrative story of like Millicent, Latenna. That's what really kind of bonded me with the Elden Ring. You know, a lot of people, when I first started doing videos, a lot of people were talking about the grander scheme ideas. And a lot of my videos were very small and very just focused on like a character, because I love the narrative part of the story. So I agree about the DLC. I agree a lot.
I am glad we are of the same mind.
Yes.
Like even Marika, like I love analyzing what she does, but analyzing her from a personal perspective is so much better. And there's so much we're eating good with that in the DLC with the Shaman Village and Midra and all of that.
Oh my gosh. I cried. I'll admit, I'm such a baby. I remember like I remember entering the area and just being so taken back by what was happening, and then getting up onto the hill and hearing the harp playing. I was like, I just like sharp inhaled and was like, oh my gosh. And I think like my eyes started to tear up, and I was like, oh my gosh, what is this? Like, this is crazy. This is amazing. This is what I've been waiting for. The narrative story. Like I said earlier, I'm definitely not excusing Marika's genocide, but and her war and violence, but I find her character to be so interesting and slightly sympathetic, and I think the DLC kind of really more hammered that home for me. I've kind of always talked about how much of it was a choice of hers. Again, like we said, free will, free choice, the greater will. How does all of that work when you become a god? Do you even have that anymore? Is that still a part of you? So I have a lot of sympathy for Queen Marika, which I know some people may not like to hear, and I get it. I do. She's done terrible things. She's not a good person at the end of the story, but I think there's a lot more layers there, and I think that is what makes her an interesting aspect of the story for sure. So when I found the Shaman Village, I was just so like blown away by it. And there's no words, there's no NPCs, there's no nothing. It's just a harp and a golden area on a hill. And I was like, oh my gosh, like this is beautiful. This is so well designed. And the emotion that it evoked out of me, I was so excited for, because I was like, dang, that's some good storytelling. This is what I wanted.
It's so solemn and tragic. Like everything about it. Like you see the finger ruins, or maybe the Elden beast fell. Maybe this is how she first interacted with the greater will. Maybe she never even asked for it. You see the Erdtree sentinels, like her most loyal knights guarding the village. Even now, they have her personal blessings, which she swore to never make again after seeing how monstrous Mesmer's actions were, and that like she herself enabled them. The minor Erdtree incantation, which is the only like she didn't share that with anyone besides Melina, who she expressly set on the path of leading to her own destruction and the destruction of her order and capital city. Like, oh, it's so poignant. Like, there's such a through line of, yeah, it's so good.
It is. It really is. And I just did my Melina video. So yeah, that was like crazy. I remember seeing the the incantation and be like, wait, that's Melena's. Oh my gosh, the connections. I was like, oh my gosh, it just makes it even better.
It's just, yeah, we'll have to talk more about that sometime. We're running out of time, but there's so many things to talk about with Melina and Mesmer. It's just like complete opposites in how Marika raised them. Like Marika she taught them both of Bonnie Village and the Shaman Village, and Mesmer went and got super angry, but like Marika taught Melina the Erdtree blessing as if like, I don't know, it's like a sign of peace or like I don't know, it's.
Yeah, we'll definitely have to talk more about it for sure, because that's a big topic.
Yeah, I think for now we are running out of time, as sad as that is. Are there any other topics you want to touch upon before the end?
No, I guess the only one that I wrote down that we didn't really talk about was whether or not Miquella charmed Malenia. But if you're not interested, we don't have to.
No, let's get into it. I feel like just looking at her intro dialogue in the base game, it's, she talks about how she dreamt that her body was dull gold and her flesh rotted, I think, and the very specific use of dream. Was she in a trance for the duration?
Mm-hmm.
Was that a benign trance? Was it done to keep her in control? Was it both in a way? What do you think about it?
Well, I find that really interesting, and I'm glad you brought that part up, because that part directly ties back to Saint Trina and this dreamlike state that she would put people in. Now, we know Malenia is the slumbering in period that I think it's Clean Rot Knight Finley carries all the way back to the Haligtree. But what happened while she was slumbering, and why is she in that slumber to begin with? I do think there is this like sense of perhaps Miquella did charm his sister, and one of the reasons why I say that is because it's specifically in the description of the unalloyed golden needle, which Millicent gives back to you. It says, there is something I must return to Malenia, the dignity, the sense of self that allowed her to resist the call of the scarlet rot. And I talked about this in my Empyrean video, but this idea of losing her sense of self and giving up her own dignity and her own pride to succeed in whatever it was she was doing with Radahn, which we know now, before it was a question mark. It was, why was Malenia fighting Radahn? Now we know that it was because he was going to be Miquella's consort. And I think it's cut content where she has a line where she whispers into his ear, you're the promised consort, he awaits you, or something like that, along the lines to Radahn right before blooming. So we know that she gave up her sense of self and her dignity to achieve Miquella's plans and to achieve his promise, not her own. And to me, that kind of harkens back to this idea of being charmed and losing yourself. Like we said with Sir Ansbach, he would be a complete enemy to Miquella and becomes an ally, versus Lita, Tialie, and Dane, who are pretty much more aligned with Miquella than anybody else, even if they weren't charmed. And I think the same could be said with Malenia. She was definitely more in line to be an ally with Miquella than anyone else, because they're twins, because they're related, they love each other, we assume that. They had a good relationship, they're very close, all of their statues have them embracing each other. But Malenia gave up her own sense of self to achieve his plans. That seems a bit extreme. And it does seem like she destroyed her own body so that he may succeed, even without knowing if he was close to succeeding or not. And she says, my brother will keep his promise. He possesses the wisdom, the allure of a god. And what is that promise? I've asked myself that so many different times. And we get the promised consort, but that has nothing to do with Malenia, and it has nothing to do with any of her goals. So, I don't know, do you have any thoughts regarding that, and why that might be a connection between her being charmed by Miquella?
Here, I'm looking up her other dialogue during her boss fight. Okay, yeah, so she says, as I awaited his return during her boss introduction, like that's what she says after she mentions the dreams. And I feel like awaiting his return might be part of the promise if it has nothing to do with the promised consort. Like, if
Mm-hmm.
she knew that Miquella had intentions to leave the Haligtree behind and become a god, which we know because she delivered the message of his plan to Radahn, then it
Right.
makes sense that she might have done so under this viewpoint of Miquella is only going away to realize his ambitions, and one day he will return. So as long as I just wait here, as long as I just wait, he'll come back. And I don't know, I think it speaks to sort of the tragedy of the fact that he never really will. Uh,
Right.
I don't know if that resonates with you or not, but
Well, it is heartbreaking, right? Her armor and her helm state my brother will keep his promise. Not I hope, not I believe, not I dream. It's my brother will keep his promise. And it's because she believes in him. But that's that extreme devotion of there's no way he won't do it. Um, Versus a more realistic view, which would be I hope my brother keeps his promise, or one day my brother may keep his promise, or you know what I'm saying? Like there's the way that it's worded, it very much comes across as she is 100% sure, and that's kind of an unrealistic expectation. And I've talked about this many times, but I'm sure we talked about it today too. You know, Miquella's strength, we never really got to see his strength, but she says that he is the most fearsome Empyrean of all. Yet we've never seen anything to even hint at him being fearsome. So I'm not sure. I think a part of me does believe that maybe Melania was charmed by Miquella, whether it be intentional or not. Because Millicent, who is this daughter slash offshoot of Melania, would never, she literally tells you, I would rather rot as myself than to bloom into something that I'm not. And Melania gives that up. Now, is it willing or is it unwilling? That's kind of my question. Does that make sense?
yeah. Okay, I have a couple of thoughts that spring off of that. I guess,
Tell
oh
me.
shit. I'm trying to like order them in a logical way. Okay. So I guess part of it is that with Millis and like oh god, I'm totally blanking. I'm so sorry.
Oh, you're
you have,
okay.
could you please just reword what you said if that's okay? It might kickstart some of my thoughts.
Yeah, so Millicent tells us that she refuses to bloom into something else, that she would rather rot into nothingness than to become something that she isn't. But we specifically hear that Melania gave up her dignity, her pride, and her sense of self that allowed her to resist the rot. So Millicent has that in her because it was once upon a time in Melania. Now we can say it's out of her because of the blooming, or it's out of her because the unalloyed golden needle broke, or however you want to say it. But a part of me wonders if that has to do with Melania being charmed, that when Miquella charms you, you lose a sense of yourself. You lose your agency, you lose your free will to say, no, you know, this is my boundary. I will not embrace the scarlet rot, even if it is to help you succeed. Instead, she does it without question, without any sense of self, without any, you know, sense of pride that she once had that kept her from answering the call of the rot. So I guess my question was just, do you think Miquella charmed Melania?
Okay, okay. Okay, I think that helped get everything resorted, so thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I think, I guess to begin with, I think that partly what she talks about, like, Miquella is the most fearsome Empyrean, is sort of speaking to what we've been talking about with the idea of him having this sort of innate charm. I, like, if you look at different areas throughout Elden Ring, like, this is the first time that they've done it in like one of their RPG games, but they also did it in Sekiro. But there's points in the game where you are unable to attack; you're just locked out of it. In Sekiro, that's because, you follow the iron code of the shinobi. You're honor bound to not attack your lord or, people that are in that status. But like in Elden Ring, it's more of a metaphysical restraint that's put upon you. It's like the piece of the round table hold, or like the two fingers, or maybe it's even Ranni. Ranni could do it too if we look at Ranala as being protected. But um, in that sense, you have this idea that there is a very real compulsion that can be placed upon people that is a limitation. Like, Fia narratively is hiding at the round table hold because Dee is trying to murder her. So she is using, like, she's like, haha, I'm a tarnished too. I can stay here. You can't do anything. Um, and I bring that up because we learn from Ansbach that we get that whole he wields love to shrive clean the hearts of man. And Ansbach says that because he's felt that effect on him. Like, he drew his sword against Miquella. And I think Leda says in dialogue, if you help her against Hornsent and then go after Ansbach next, I think she tells you that that Ansbach was the one to wound Miquella, or that he did wound Miquella in some way. So you see how Ansbach could get close enough to attack him, but also how he has that sort of strength of just pacifying the mind and compelling obedience. And I think that might be partially what Millennia is speaking to when she talks about his fearsome power. So it stands to reason that he did charm her. That being said, I feel like some of the stuff about Millicent's inner strength and nobility might be more about Millennia's personal journey with the rot rather than Miquella. I don't want to just say that to detract from the idea of using the symbolism because, speculation draws from all sources, but I only bring it up because I think from the lens of Millicent representing Millennia's fighting spirit, you see this connection between running water and the cleansing of the rot through like the blue dancer swordsman that taught Millennia, who also like historically sealed the rot. And through that lens, Millicent is the only person of the 5 daughters of Millennia, daughters on quote unquote, they're like flower buds that came out of the scarlet rot. But Millicent's the only daughter that can do the waterfowl dance, so she sort of represents the height of Millennia's fighting prowess, which represents the running water that resisted the rot.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, it might be like, rather than Millicent representing a sense of self that Millennia lost because of the unalloyed gold, it might be that Millennia, when she gave up her personal ideals and personal self to the Scarlet Rot when it bloomed, she lost Millicent along with the other daughters, and in their metaphorical reconnection with her at the Haligtree, she goes through like her final metamorphosis. Either Millicent dies and her water remelts with Millennia, and Millennia regains the strength to resist the rot, so she like removes her own needle and would probably die. I'd rather rot and die than become something other than myself. Or she like
Mm-hmm.
completes her ascension. I know that was a lot, so and it's fine to disagree too. I think it's up in the air, to be honest. So
No, I think that's interesting. Millicent is one of my favorite characters, and I can't help but do her quest line every time I replay the game because she's just so fun to theorize about, and she's such an interesting character. But yeah, I think that that's a really interesting point of view. I think that lines up really well too, because we see this juxtaposition between the two of them, where Millennia, as she's struck down, decides to bloom again, whereas Millicent, when she's struck down, decides, never mind, I don't want to do this, I'll take it out myself. Even if she wins, if you help her, she's like, no, this isn't what I want to be, this isn't who I want to be. And so you see that difference between their characters, but like we said, they were once one, so it is a part of Millennia that she lost. But I like the idea that maybe Millennia was charmed. You said something during your response though that I kind of wanted to touch on just really briefly. So you said that Leda tells you Sir Ansbach is the one who wounded the Empyrean, and that's referring to Miquella. Well, a lot of people don't seem to realize I see a lot of people online talking about how Miquella and Ranni must be connected because they both have 4 arms. Miquella only has 3. If we take a closer look at his body, one of his sleeves is missing an arm. So I don't know if that's potentially what happened, if Sir Ansbach chopped off his arm, or if that was just like maybe a more specific design that has something lore specific that I can't think of. But I just thought that was an interesting point of view and a little detail.
No, I completely agree. Because I don't really know my full reading of it either. It's like, because you see in the Shadowkeep, he's got that line where he's like, I abandon here my arm dexterous. And I don't know if there's another cross where he abandons another arm, but if that's the
I think
only
it's
one,
Sinistrals.
Oh, yeah, so he does abandon 2 arms.
Mm-hmm.
So why does he have 3 arms?
Yeah, it's weird. It's very strange, but I remember talking to someone about it because they were like, he's Ranni, and I was like, no, because he has 4 arms. I'm like, no, he's got 3. Don't ask me why, but he does.
A very long time ago, I can't even remember who told me this, and I feel bad because it was very, very smart, but someone brought up that Rani's 4 arms might be a reference to Hinduism, and a lot of how their depictions have these many-armed gods, and how 4 arms could, like, specifically represent some sort of, like, inner peace or, like, completeness. So maybe that's where they're going. Like, Miquella only has 3 arms, so he's incomplete? Question mark?
That's kind of cool. I like that.
Yeah, I'm not sure, though.
I think that's an interesting idea, and I think that's a fun idea to think about too, because there's a lot of religious connections and not just Western religions that are connected to the story of Elden Ring. So I think it's fun to remind ourselves about, like, oh yeah, that is a thing. I forgot about 4 armed gods. Maybe that's what it is.
Yeah, literally. There's so much, like, like the Golden Order is so Christian. There's so much, like, Norse and Gaelic inspiration, mythologically speaking. And then we get into the DLC, and it gets much more like, I guess Eastern in a way, because you have, like, all of these, you got the Chinese dragon dance and tutelary deities. I guess tutelary deities are, like, patron gods, so they can be anywhere, but yeah. But yeah, this has been wonderful. This has been a very fun conversation.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This has been a wild. I mean, we went down all the topics, it seems like. I was not expecting to talk about Ranni today, but that was a nice little surprise.
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah.
But yeah, where can viewers find your content?
You can find me on YouTube, AHumanJusticar. That's my channel. You can find my shorts and my long-form lore videos as well.
Okay. Do you have anything planned to release in the next month or so?
I do. So I just released my Melina is not Miquella video, and I think in about a week I will be releasing another Shadow of the Erdtree centric video, but I don't want to give too much away.
Yeah, you'll have to go and watch for yourself. But yeah, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you again for joining.
Thank you for having me. This was so much fun.
And thank you to all of the viewers for joining and watching this far. As always, leave a comment below with your own thoughts and ideas. Go check out AHumanJusticar's work. She's a very good content creator. Yeah, I can't wait to release more episodes in this vein, get deeper into some of the other lore topics. I think my next one will probably be a sort of macro overview of how the DLC tries to integrate with the base game, where it succeeds, where it fails, so stay tuned for that. And as usual, don't you dare go hollow on me.